Good evening, y'all. Thank you all so much for joining me in tonight's presentation. It really means a lot that y'all are coming out. And also hello to everybody who is watching the recording on YouTube. My name is Joey Harmon, and I'm a licensed professional counselor working at the Heights location of Eden's Counseling Group in Houston, Texas. I earned my Master's of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling from the University of North Texas and my Bachelor of Arts in Psychology at Houston Baptist University. I'm very excited, very excited to discuss tonight's topic with y'all. This is an area that really not many mental health professionals have explored from a post-traumatic standpoint. And so I hope to do justice to both this topic as well as those who find themselves within this world. You will receive a feedback form. I believe Marcus has already posted it in the chat. So whenever the presentation is at an end, just go ahead and fill that out. And it would mean a lot. Thank you so much. So here's our general outline for tonight. We're going to be lingering on some sections a little bit longer and shorter than others. And as you can see at the bottom, we will have time for a Q&A section at the end for about 15 minutes or so. So if you develop any questions over the course of the presentation, please just save them for the end because I will not necessarily be reading the chat until then. So before going any further, I wanted to discuss what this presentation is not, in case there are any misconceptions. I'm not going to give my personal opinions on the extents that I either believe or disbelieve in the experiences I'm going to describe. And I'm also not going to suggest that the audience needs to believe or disbelieve the literal subject matter that will be discussed tonight. My focus, like I said earlier, is going to be on the post-traumatic challenges of the alleged observers of these phenomena, as well as communication strategies that we can incorporate for helping them emotionally. I'm going to do my best to stay within my lane as a mental health practitioner, as opposed to pretending that I'm a researcher in these fields when I'm not. And in addition, I want to accentuate that not everyone who experiences high strangeness is necessarily traumatized, either during or after the experience. And I don't wish to paint with too broad a brush when describing this population. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on those who exhibit symptoms of trauma following both an encounter as well as trauma following the social backlash of discussing said encounter. Many of the struggles that I'll discuss will apply to some degree to non-traumatized high strangeness eyewitnesses. But again, my focus will be on trauma victims of high strangeness. Throughout my research, I pulled largely from anecdotal or qualitative data by listening to interviews of eyewitnesses, as well as going to the following subreddits to hear from eyewitnesses about any psychological struggles that they've had to endure following their traumatic high strangeness experiences. What I basically did was I put out a call to members of these forums, asking if anyone would be willing to share any social and or psychological struggles they've had to endure following an encounter. I recognize this isn't terribly comprehensive. It's just that some forums were easier to make a post on than others. Try to reach out to a few others. These are the ones that were just the most receptive. There isn't much in the way of formal peer-reviewed studies on the stress endured by high strangeness experiencers. So the information I've pulled from is largely from anecdotal cases. That being said, as we approach the end of our presentation tonight, based on the topics that I've included towards the end, those kind of lend themselves more to research. So you'll see more of that a little bit later on. So what is high strangeness? Different people will give you different definitions, but for the purposes strictly of this presentation, I'm going to define high strangeness as unexplained and or unconfirmed phenomena that are anecdotally witnessed by observers, but have yet to be officially classified. The three areas overwhelmingly associated with high strangeness are cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals like Sasquatches, lake monsters, animals thought to be extinct, but maybe they're still around, like the thylacines, things of that nature. So the study of unknown or unconfirmed animals, paranormal activities, i.e. ghosts, and the UFO and UAP phenomenon. People will have varying opinions regarding the extent that certain subcategories within these topics actually fall under the umbrella of high strangeness, but again, strictly for the purposes of this presentation, strictly for the sake of simplicity, I am going to consolidate these three groups under this one overarching term. And part of my reasoning for lumping them together is that unifying theme of the unexplained amongst these groups. And we will discuss later on how that in and of itself plays a role in the trauma which can potentially develop. While the existence of these phenomena are debated, what isn't in question is that real, everyday human beings have been negatively impacted by them. And so, therefore, we owe it to them as members of the human race to treat them with the sense of dignity that they're deserving. I also wanted to give a very brief overview of what trauma is. The Cambridge Dictionary defines trauma as severe and lasting emotional shock and pain caused by an extremely upsetting experience. So, again, that's severe and lasting emotional shock and pain caused by an extremely upsetting experience. I would personally change the end of that definition to one or more extremely upsetting experiences, since trauma, of course, does not happen in a vacuum. In other words, what traumatic responses are is that they are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. The mind and the body of an individual are really trying to protect that person from any further harm, whether that harm be physical, emotional, and or sexual. The thing is, these attempts at self-preservation will oftentimes backfire, unfortunately, or are expressed when they aren't necessary. So, for example, somebody traumatized by gun violence might duck under a car or a table when they hear fireworks. So, if they hear genuine gunshots going off, that would be a safe thing to do to try to protect themselves. But when fireworks are going off, that's not necessary. That could be embarrassing for the person after the fact, but their mind and their body is just trying to keep them safe in that moment, regardless of what's really going on out in the world. So within the context of tonight's topic, the brain and the body's survival instincts could arise in the form of attempting to protect the eyewitness from either the entity itself, from any trauma they might have brought on during the encounter, and or keeping them safe after having been abandoned by those formerly trusted to keep them safe. I came across a story of an alleged Bigfoot encounter that I believe does a really good, succinct job at highlighting both the terrors of a strangeness encounter, as well as the emotional harm that others can unfortunately provide after the fact. This story is narrated by a YouTuber who goes by the pseudonym Bob Gimlin, Gymlan, who briefly describes the narrative, dictates the narrative, and then gives his personal thoughts on it at the end. However, we won't be going over that latter part purely in the interest of time. But if you wish to view the video in its entirety, I'm going to paste a link to it in the chat right now that you can then look at after the fact. I'm also not trying to convince anybody of the factual legitimacy of this story, nor attempting to scare or shock anyone. As a potential trigger warning, some of the eyewitness descriptions and illustrations can be unsettling. I am purposefully going to skip over the more disturbing parts of the report because, again, my intention with this is not to shock and awe anyone. I will say the eyewitness is not physically harmed in any way. Again, just because certain sections are more descriptive and they ultimately aren't needed for tonight's purposes, I'm going to be skipping past them to more relevant sections. So without further ado, if I can, that's not what I'm trying to do. There we go. So let's roll.
Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. A long time ago, I told a witness that I would tell the story of his encounter, and I figure late is better than never. For the sake of full disclosure, I did a significant amount of editing to his report. We'd be here for days if I didn't. But the events and wording are entirely accurate to the report and text I received. Bob, I was only 15 when it happened. It was 1999, I have never really claimed to know 100% what it was that happened, but it has been on my mind forever, like a bad dream. We were at a campsite some 2 hours southeast of Knoxville, Tennessee. It is incredibly picturesque. We made this trip, usually a couple times a year, both before and after my experience. My parents slept in the RV, and I slept in the tent, because I thought it was real camping. It was the first night there on a long weekend. It was maybe 1 or 2 a.m. when I woke up to hear this hushed or muffled moaning, in between really fast gibberish. It was really fast, really, really fast. It sighed and moaned between this fast talking. The gibberish was more like syllables than words. I wasn't awake for more than a couple seconds before it started messing with the tent. It ended up not opening the tent with the zipper, but the fabric along the zipper was creased and weaker than the rest. It tore the tent open, not opening the zipper, but tearing the fabric along the zipper line where the fabric was weakest. As soon as there was a big enough opening, the chatter turned into what I'd say sounded a lot like a whinny from a horse. I have never been so scared since. I remember my stomach turning, exactly like a drop on a roller coaster. I hid in the sleeping bag. I couldn't see anyway. I just flipped the top of my sleeping bag over my head and squeezed it tightly. I tried to curl into a ball. Then it came inside the tent. It smelled like garbage, like old hot poultry in the trash.
So now I'm going to be skipping ahead to a section about his father's reaction after.
So this is where it gets strange. My dad didn't think it was a big deal. I remember he was surprised that I wouldn't spend the rest of the night in the tent or any of the following nights. He said it was a big old dog. Not just from my story, I mean. He said he saw it run away. A big old skinny dog is what he said. He said that it had smelled my jerky, which I didn't have, or my M&Ms, which I did have, and that it was just sniffing my face, as dogs do. I asked what breed this dog he saw was. He said he didn't know. But if he saw it, how did he not know what kind of dog it was? I don't think he actually saw a dog. I think he thinks he saw a dog. The way the light turned on outside the RV was kind of useless because it shined right into the little awning thing. So if the awning was down, which it was, the light just shined into the canvas. There was a good 3 or 4 seconds between when I screamed, causing it to leave, and my dad opening the door and yelling, "Hey." From where I'm standing, that 3 or 4 seconds was long enough for whatever it was to have been out of direct sight of my dad, or at least out of the light. Here's the other troubling part, I guess. My dad is interested in all things paranormal. He invokes the name of Art Bell as if it were a religious deity. To my dad, how the pyramids couldn't have been built by humans with no help is standard conversation. So I just don't get why he is so convinced that it was a dog. I don't think it was a dog. To this day, I don't think it was a dog. No dog can make that chatter, and no dog has hands like that. And I have never brought this up to my dad without him laughing at me like I'm crazy. One time we were driving together, and a lady was walking a big dog, and my dad covered my eyes, and he shouted, don't look, it's Bigfoot." Or if a big dog is on TV, he'll stare at me with grave concern, to tease me. Maybe it just hurts because I could probably convince my dad that the movie E.T. is based on actual events if I tried hard enough. Honestly, if this thing just started beating me, I feel like it would have been a lot less traumatic. At the time and looking back, I remember feeling like it was treating me as though I was precious, like I was very important. I've had chills since the first line of this. This was the Smokies. Are you familiar with Politis? I think I was close to being one of those. Like I think I already said. I remember it like it was a bad dream. I don't think it was a dream, but that's how my memory sees it. In that dream format, if that makes any sense. In those moments, I was acting under pure animal instinct. That smell, that chatter, and the way it was pressing down on me are all things I'll never forget. It was the only time I ever understood the meaning of sick with fear, and I hope it never happens again. My stomach just plunged. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
So thank you all for watching. Like I said, the purpose of that was to kind of serve as a primer for discussing the traumas that are unique to this population, to high-strangeness eyewitnesses. And so now moving on to eyewitnesses themselves, let's move into discussing the typical experiences of someone traumatized by a high-strangeness event, like the individual in the video that we just watched. So there are two main types of traumas associated with these kinds of encounters. There is the event itself, and then the social backlash. Starting with the first component, experiencing high strangeness in and of itself can be surprising at best and torturous at worst. Sometimes these sightings are benign, but others can be very frightening and harrowing. There are reports of people believing that their very life, was being directly threatened by the subject of their encounter, particularly with cryptid eyewitnesses and ghost eyewitnesses, and strong feelings of uneasiness, shock, and or terror can accompany the event. Physiologically, people often report having a racing heart, shallow breathing, feeling as if they're frozen, having their hair stand up both during the encounter and while they're remembering the encounter, which of course are all reactions to trauma, because these are the body's way of trying to get the person into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? To either fight the thing that is threatening their life, to run away from it, or to basically pretend like you're dead, or to try to hide from it, be still so it doesn't notice you, things like that. So your body is going to go into that kind of physiological state. It's also not uncommon for high strangeness trauma victims to never want to return to the area of their encounter or even into similar kinds of places. Again, for cryptid eyewitnesses, this usually takes the form of even lifelong hunters and outdoors people never going back into the forest ever again because they never want to risk sharing, seeing again what they saw. So there is the literal entity, creature, object, what have you, that can be frightening. But in addition, there can also be a massive worldview shift for an individual upon encountering something that they believed wasn't real to begin with. This sense of ontological shock can be very profound and can cause great degrees of confusion for years following the events. One quote that's kind of stuck with me for a while related to this is, "I made eye contact with something I didn't believe in." Right? To make eye contact with something one didn't believe in previously. And so people might end up wrestling with and suffering more from having to recalibrate what they thought was true, maybe more so than the literal encounter themselves, and to be potentially denied answers for the rest of their lives. And then also, secondly, and potentially more damaging, is the fear of repercussions of telling anybody about the experience, as well as the negative social ramifications from other people if they do say anything. Those traumatized by high strangeness are left in a particularly confusing position because they may not know what to do exactly about this encounter that they've just had. Many will know how it's going to sound if they say that they saw a cryptid, a monster, a ghost, an alien, what have you. And so this population is at particularly high risk of never processing their trauma in any kind of healthy way. This partially contributes to the anger that many eyewitnesses will also face, that they had this traumatic event forced upon them. And now they feel they can't even go talk about it with anybody because, again, they know how it's going to sound. They're angry that they're in this position when they never asked for it, and then ultimately feel as if there's nothing they can really do about it anyway. Some of what eyewitnesses stand to lose and have historically lost include some of the following. These are included here because they have happened to eyewitnesses in the past. Now, mind you, this list is neither definitive nor comprehensive, and much of this is dependent on the culture of the alleged eyewitnesses and the family and community that they come from. But nevertheless, it is worth detailing what many fear putting at stake if they do try to come clean about what happened to them. So that first part, respect from loved ones. People suffering from trauma will be hesitant to risk losing those who are the closest to them as they attempt to make sense of what happened. It can be a double whammy of losing a sense of normalcy and safety from an encounter, but then also having the pain of betrayal if those closest to them turn their backs in the midst of their suffering. Respect from their community or their social status. This can extrapolate to coworkers, members of a religious organization, or depending on the size of the town, the entire community that the eyewitness lives in. And those with a high social status may fear that they have the most to lose if people see them as either a lunatic or a liar. Employment. Especially back in the day, alleged eyewitnesses may no longer be seen as stable enough to continue their job, especially if they have a high ranking job with a lot of responsibility, a lot of people relying on them. Or the backlash of having them associated um, with their place of employment may cause the business to fire them in order to maintain the image of the company. It may also be difficult for an eyewitness to find stable employment afterwards, depending on how well known their claims are. Future credibility. Why would anyone want to trust somebody who claims they saw a monster in the woods or something supposedly out of a fairy tale? And then privacy and dignity. Alleged eyewitnesses may find themselves hounded by others, largely strangers, wanting ceaselessly to either mock them for the report or to endlessly ask them about it if their name was attached to their claims of what happened to them. And of course, there are a multitude of ways in which all of these can intersect with one another, causing a greater degree of hardship than any one of these would leave on their own. So, eyewitnesses may believe that they are in several lose lose situations if they talk about what they've gone through. Either they're a respected member of the community and they risk losing their social status, job, sense of respect, what have you, or they already don't feel respected by others and they risk being all the more ridiculed or pitied. They're confronted with either being potentially betrayed by the very people who would normally have their back or having the burning agony of keeping this secret with them, never to reveal to the world the traumatic incident that has been plaguing them. Which leaves an obvious question. How do traumatized eyewitnesses cope? One solution to the problem of being ridiculed for telling your story is to tell the story anonymously. This can be done through a variety of different methods, one of which that has become increasingly common recently is telling one story on a podcast under a pseudonym. Some will consume media related to their encounters, like podcasts, YouTube channels, and videos, like the one that we just saw, and TV shows to try to find comfort. Still, many others will take to internet communities to post about what they saw in like-minded groups, such as the groups that I had mentioned earlier. Which also then segues very nicely into the next common coping skill. So eyewitnesses may attempt to find peace by joining communities of other eyewitnesses and or those who are open-minded about these kinds of subjects. These communities are often composed of different researchers, artists, authors, scientists, and others who meet either online or in person at a variety of different conventions, like the one that you see here, the Mothman Festival, held every year in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Having access to such groups can provide a greater sense of normalcy to high strangeness trauma victims because it can help people feel as if they aren't alone and they can meet others who will be affirming regarding what they experienced as opposed to those who just completely treat them, like a lunatic. And lastly, eyewitnesses often become absorbed in the subject of their encounter in order to help make better sense of what they saw, especially if they didn't believe in the phenomenon beforehand. Doing so allows for an outlet to actually process their experiences in a manner deemed safe to them. Ultimately, what all three of these approaches are doing is that they are attempts at trying to reestablish a sense of community and or normalcy to one's life. Now, just like with any other coping skill, there is the potential for harm if any of these are taken to an extreme. For example, if a parent were to begin neglecting their children because they became absorbed in studying lake monsters, that would be relying on that coping mechanism in an unhealthy way. And going back to the high strangeness communities I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, people can still be ridiculed even within those circles. So none of these coping skills are bad, certainly, in and of themselves. It's just that the more avenues of support a trauma victim has, the more peace they'll be able to attain, and the more fulfilling a life they'll be able to live following their encounter. So instead of only having a few potentially limited resources for processing their anguish, becoming a supportive ally can open up more doors for them. Sort of like how the more blocks there are in a toy house, like a Lego house, the sturdier it's ultimately going to be. Which then begs the question of how we can be supportive of those negatively impacted by such events without either belittling them or compromising our own worldviews. And I'd like to address that last part first, because I really want to allay any fears about what acceptance actually looks like. Acceptance of a person is not the same as full acceptance of their story. I'll say it again. Acceptance of a person is not the same as full acceptance of the person's story. Critical thinking does not need to be abandoned in order to make room for empathy. The brain and the hearts do not need to be at odds. What acceptance really means, especially within this context, is accepting that the human being in front of you, the same person who participates in our democracy, and the same person whose word would carry weight on a jury, this human being had a human experience with human reactions, whatever it was that they saw. You might not be able to relate with what they're going through, but what you can do is you can respect the emotions that they have regarding the events. One can identify with the emotions without wholeheartedly signing off that what they experienced had actually occurred. One can be supportive and treat someone with decency without having to fulfill this need to emphasize what they believe really occurred. For example, you don't need to believe in aliens to empathize with a UFO eyewitness because you have felt confused and startled before. You don't have to believe in ghosts to empathize with a ghost eyewitness, but you have felt terrified before and you have felt helpless before. See, those are the emotional experiences that you and this eyewitness have that common ground on, whatever it is they say that they saw. And again, this isn't me either dismissing or confirming any examples of high strangeness. It's just that we must continue to dispel the lie that one must see eye to eye with somebody in order to treat them with kindness. And that, of course, is a concept that can be applied far beyond the scope of this presentation tonight. And before going to specifics, I wanted to normalize why we might get defensive whenever we encounter people whose experiences don't align with our own. I mean, whether that's high strangeness or otherwise, but especially for high strangeness in tonight, due to the nature of it, particularly for paranormal and UFO sightings, being confronted with their possible realities may not mesh very well with many Western worldviews. Being told by a sincere friend that they saw a ghost is naturally going to elicit a different type of reaction than if they claimed to have seen a coyote or a spider. And again, this goes back to what was said earlier regarding the lie that one must wholeheartedly believe somebody in order to treat them with dignity. It makes sense to automatically feel defensive. That's not necessarily something that you have control over. But you got to ask yourself, to what degree are we going to let our needs to feel right interfere with treating somebody with compassion, especially if this is a person that we claim to love? So now that we've established that one does not need to believe a high strangeness eyewitness or need to change their worldview in order to still be kind, how do we go about interacting with traumatized eyewitnesses of alleged high strangeness events? The first thing is to use the basics of active listening, of course, good eye contact, having your body facing towards the person. There's this rule within play therapy, which is a service that I provide where the therapist's toes follows their nose, right? So that way your toes follow your nose, your entire body is oriented directly at that person, whoever whether it's the kid that you're tracking or even an adult in session. Nodding your head along as they're saying what they want to say, not interrupting, what have you. Next is to pay attention to what emotions you believe the person is feeling as they tell their story, and or what emotions they were feeling as they were having their encounter. And again, you don't need to have gone through what they went through or believe in the legitimacy of what they claim they saw, but you have felt frightened, confused, shocked, etc. Connect with them emotionally because you have felt those feelings before. And in doing so, you'll be activating your mirror neurons, which are these specific kinds of neurons that are related to developing empathy. Whenever someone's expressing a certain emotion and you start to feel that emotion as well, those are your mirror neurons kicking in. And those allow you to better engage with them. And even if you're unsure of what they are or were specifically feeling, just make your best educated guess and stick with it until proven otherwise. Because, it's better to get some practice in than to not attempt at all. And after all, practice makes perfect. Patiently wait out their story and focus on their emotional experiences. Use language like, that must have been horrifying. I don't blame you for being confused. I see why you're angry that this happened to you. Things of that nature. Identify an emotion and provide a validating response based on that emotion. Tell them something you'd like to hear if you felt the way that they are feeling. These skills can be used when interacting with anybody telling you any kind of emotionally charged story. Of course, with any kind of story whatsoever. On the off chance you find yourself pressed on whether or not you believe them, if they ask you, which they may not necessarily, and you're unsure of whether or not you believe them, simply say, I don't know what to make of it, but clearly something happened to you. I don't know is a perfectly good answer when it is an honest answer. However, if you truly just do not believe that the phenomenon they're describing exists and they ask your opinion on it, you can tell them something along the lines of, well, I know you saw something, you aren't lying to me, and you aren't crazy. This is clearly something that shook you up, and I want to support you, right? Because it is clearly something that shook them up, and you can believe that, and you can trust in that. And you can say all of that with confidence because we know, as established earlier, that supporting someone emotionally is not the same as agreeing with them. And we don't want to leave critical thinking behind in any of this. So if you feel compelled to question them further about their experience, either to learn more about what happened and or to politely maybe offer some alternatives on what they saw if you're not entirely sure, then just wait until they're not in an emotionally volatile state. They may not be at the time, but it's also very possible for any trauma victims to find themselves feeling very raw and exposed when discussing what occurred to them. The neurological reason for this is that parts of the brain that are most conducive to survival are the ones that are going to be kicking in to protect the individual. So the more core parts of the brain aren't able to distinguish between remembering and reliving a traumatic event and actually being in life-threatening danger. So the higher reasoning parts of the brain may not be functioning at full capacity when someone is telling their story, since the brain's focus in that moment is to keep the person safe. And of course, again, to emphasize, that's not to say that everyone who is retelling their encounter will be in that emotionally exposed state. It's just good to be aware of that ahead of time. And if you do desire to respectfully engage in dialogue regarding other potential explanations for what they experienced, remember to just always come from the approach of respect and decency. Your goal is to discuss differing opinions while maintaining your relationship with the person. Avoid outright saying, I don't believe you, and instead use phrases such as, well, I'm just really not sure what to think of it or what to make of it. And speaking of awareness, it's also important to go over multicultural considerations when discussing high strangeness, particularly from the standpoint of indigenous cultures. Much of overall Western culture is uncoupled from the acceptance of spiritual realities, and therefore will be inherently more dismissive of whatever doesn't fit into a more secular, materialistic worldview. However, that's not necessarily the case for many non-Western cultures. Many will readily embrace different aspects of the phenomena described earlier and incorporate this acknowledgement of them into their ways of life. For example, Strain describes in her paper how both Bigfoots and the quote unquote hairy man pictograph that's pasted below in the bottom right, um, which is a roughly 1,000-year-old cave painting associated with Sasquatches, are both associated by some members of the Tool River Reservation with healing. So much so that the Tool River alcoholism program which is a substance abuse recovery center, was purposefully built near these cave paintings. In addition, many will grow up hearing stories about spirits and quote unquote unclassified animals from a non-folkloric perspective and may view them with the same manner as other more mundane elements of life and wildlife, like foxes and bears and things of that nature. So when these phenomena are dismissed outright by non-local, largely Western researchers, the locals who have been describing these kinds of experiences for centuries may feel angry and rejected. And now, it should be noted, of course, that obviously not every person in every non-Western or indigenous society will be uniform in their beliefs about what might otherwise be described as quote unquote high strangeness. Not everyone will agree on the extent that these cases should or should not be seen as true, and it would be very inappropriate to assume otherwise. In addition, this is not saying that folklore as a concept cannot exist or that members of indigenous communities, don't recognize the potentially fictitious nature of folklore. However, I just want to harken back to what was said earlier regarding being respectful, regardless of one's personal opinion on the existence or non-existence of extraordinary entities. Commenting on these cultural considerations is just another effort to promote respect for those who might otherwise be dismissed and to educate on the potential normality of these subjects amongst diverse populations. I want to be mindful of our time, so I wanted to spend these last few minutes kind of briefly discussing the potential for therapeutic options for victims of high strangeness trauma, as well as why some members of this community may attempt to try to avoid them altogether. This information could be useful for anybody who knows someone traumatized by an extraordinary phenomenon, and or anybody watching this who might find themselves within this community, within this category. Eyewitnesses might want to avoid a counselor for many of the same reasons described earlier regarding why they wouldn't tell others about their encounter whatsoever, right? Fear of ridicule, not being believed, etc. However, therapists specifically have a perceived level of power within our culture that may particularly dissuade someone from seeking any kind of therapy altogether. Some alleged eyewitnesses may fear being labeled with a diagnosis like schizophrenia after a single session if they say that they saw something like a ghost or a UFO. And others might fear that if one is quote unquote too honest with their therapist, the clinician will then have them brought to a psych ward against their will or something like that. Many may inherently mistrust mental health workers outright and or have had negative experiences with therapists in the past that would then make it, difficult for them and make them uneasy about seeing another one, especially for such a stigmatized topic. And this is part of a larger conversation involving the general public's, level of trust for mental health workers. And I don't intend to broach the entirety of that at the tail end of a presentation about a different topic. Just to address the second concern first, there are a great many steps that would need to be taken before a therapist were to contact the authorities in any capacity. It's a very, very rare occurrence. Mental health workers can only alert the authorities if they believe that the client is in danger of harming themselves or harming somebody else. And if that person isn't willing to take any steps to help alleviate those worries first, like if they're not willing to fill out what's called a suicide contract, where they list out different people they can talk to if they're feeling suicidal, different hotlines they can call, different activities they can do, etc. I personally, as a counselor, have spoken with many clients several times about topics like self-harm and suicide. And despite all those conversations, I have never needed to escalate to actually ever needing to call an escort for them in any capacity. And therapists aren't able to force somebody to go to a psych ward because they say they've encountered something that is otherwise unrecognized by science. I can't speak for all other states, but I can also say in the state of Texas, if someone is on their way somewhere in any capacity, they have the right to deny services. They have the right to walk out, all that good stuff, if they're being escorted and whatnot to a hospital. And regarding potential diagnoses and wanting to avoid them, I would say that this more falls under the umbrella of whether or not the client believes that any potential therapist would be a good professional fit for them. It would behoove a client or potential client to inquire ahead of time whether or not the potential therapist would be affirming towards their experiences before booking an intake session. So here at Edens, we offer free 15-minute consultations with therapists before any paperwork or formal intake appointment is scheduled, so that clients have greater confidence when selecting a professional before, going into things formally. So in seeking a potential therapist, anyone, whether they've been affected by high-strangeness or not, should inquire with a potential therapist to see if they'd be willing to offer, a similar service, free 15-minute phone call, just want to chat, see if they're going to be a good fit before moving forward with anything. And in spite of all these understanding concerns, there are thankfully a variety of therapeutic trauma interventions that can help those who are suffering from the anguishes of their past. Among these include brain spotting, EMDR, body scan meditation, prolonged exposure or systematic desensitization, a variety of different cognitive therapies, and acceptance and commitment therapy. Therapists are also trained in what's called unconditional positive regard, which means that the client doesn't need to jump through any hoops or behave in a particular manner for the therapist to regard them positively, right? In addition, regarding confidentiality, therapists are bound by federal and state laws such as HIPAA, as well as our codes of ethics, which prevent us from disclosing either stories from our clients or especially their identifying information. Violating said confidentiality can lead to a lot of trouble for a therapist, to put it lightly, as you can see at the bottom of the screen there. So while it may be intimidating at first, finding a proper, affirming, trauma-informed therapist could provide yet another stable form of support in a traumatized eyewitness's life to help alleviate their suffering and grow towards a brighter future. And of course, now for a quick shameless plug before moving on to the Q&A. Gotta love a shameless plug. After speaking with several of my colleagues who work at Edens Counseling Group, I can confidently say that we have at least a few clinicians, myself included, who would be warm and compassionate to this population. We are able to see clients either in person at our 3 Houston locations, throughout all of Texas for virtual counseling, and several other states depending on different licenses. In addition to helping folks with trauma, we also provide play therapy, adolescent counseling, counseling for individual adults, various ongoing groups, couples counseling, family counseling, and career counseling or coaching. And before we head out, there were a lot of people who were very supportive of me while I was putting this together. Lots of people, many of which are here tonight in the audience, and I'm really appreciative. I wanted to specifically give shout outs to Karak St. Lawrence, who runs the Crash Course Cryptozoology YouTube channel, as well as the team over at the Cryptid Campfire podcast. They all offered their insights and advice not only on the topic itself, but also how I could obtain some anecdotal data. So here are my references that I used for tonight. And now for the next, I believe, 15 minutes, I want to open the floor up to any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to type it up and post it in the chat. Go ahead and take a second or two. If you have any questions, I'll just sit here and kind of chill. And I've got it popped up so I can see them as soon as they come up for me. And I'll say them out loud. I won't say the specific name, but for those who are watching on YouTube after the fact, I'll repeat the question out loud so that way it's understood what I'm addressing. Right. Did you experience any hesitancy from your colleagues when pitching this presentation idea? Really, no. And I'm very thankful for that. Whenever I would talk to, now I admittedly was hesitant to talk about it, but to the people that I did talk about this with, my coworkers, I mean, they were very supportive, very interested, very intrigued in the subject material. And I'm very thankful for that, which is why I wanted to, you know, which is why I wanted to include, in the shameless plug section, when I said that there were a few people who work here that I think would be good fits for people within this traumatized community, I meant it. And I said that because people were enthusiastic and they were also saying, yeah, I mean, the mental health community really hasn't been doing anything to address the specific trauma of these eyewitnesses. So thank you for your question. I got a personal text from one of the audience members What are your plans, if any, about creating an organized support group going forward? That would be awesome. That would be wonderful. I love the idea of that. And for truly the past several years, really, I've been thinking about, the potential for that and the idea of that. I struggle with, the implementation of that. I know when I was formerly under my provisional license and I had a supervisor I needed to meet with, um, you know, I spoke with her about it and she was also very supportive, but also said like, well, hey, you just got to be really careful because counseling laws can be very strict and they oftentimes aren't necessarily federalized. HIPAA is federalized, but a lot of counseling laws will differ by state. So I would need to emphasize that while I'm a counselor, I'm not their counselor. It's a support group, but it's not a therapeutic group. And that I would encourage them to seek out their own therapists, but that this is just a support group. And and truth be told, there are quite a few avenues for that kind of already, maybe not necessarily run by mental health practitioners. Um, but there are some outlets out there already that people feel that, they can kind of get that off their chest a little bit. So I'm not opposed to that. I'm also not opposed to some kind of like, I don't know, credentialing service or CEU or some kind of rostering for high-strangeness affirming therapists. Um, but we'll just kind of have to see where the future holds. Do you believe you are seeing high strangeness as a more normalized subject that people are willing to discuss? I would say that. It's become a lot more, I don't want to say mainstream because it's not there, but there isn't that same sense of overwhelming fear that maybe we've seen in generations past. I want to mention a really great quote that I heard. That question was asked of someone who is a proper researcher within this kind of field. Um, and they said, no, if anything, people are becoming less critical potentially and just wanting to hear a bunch of stories without wanting to really think for themselves about the matter on the subject. So I think it's certainly becoming more and more normalized, which is great from a mental health standpoint, and hopefully that will encourage people to go seek the help that they deserve, and hopefully other therapists out there will be more receptive to this population, which is a neglected trauma population, quite frankly. But like I said earlier, regarding critical thinking, that doesn't mean that you necessarily need to believe absolutely everything you hear. Critical thinking is very important. Um, long story long, yes, I do think it is more normalized. And so hopefully people will seek out more formal support because of it. Anyone else? How many people with encounters in your research were willing to go to therapy or counseling for their trauma? I couldn't say. I was able to read a couple of responses to my Reddit posts that I made, kind of referencing a therapist or somebody knew somebody who then referenced the therapist, but even that person, since that was secondhand or third hand, even they couldn't say whether or not it was definitively for what they experienced. There's also this lingo used within mental health circles called the quote unquote presenting problem, which is the initial reason someone might go to therapy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually the largest issue they have going on. So, for example, someone might go to therapy because they're having difficulty with focusing and paying attention, but then it comes to light later on that they're struggling with severe levels of anxiety and they've never really learned how to accept that and handle that in a healthy manner. And so that's led to concentration issues, right? The presenting problem is concentration, but really the real problem is anxiety. So it's possible that people will have symptoms of trauma because of what they experienced, but they don't necessarily know that it's because of that's it's because of what they experienced. And then as they establish rapport with their therapist, hopefully it would come up. Admittedly, that's speculation. Um, further research is needed. Certainly further research is needed within this area. Yeah, great questions, really great questions. Do you see a similar trend in individuals who suffer from trauma from encounters such as past trauma, medical conditions, etc.? Yeah, definitely. I think the question is, do I see trends in like how trauma presents itself depending on the source of the trauma or how that trauma started? So um, yes and no, it depends, right? Just like with anything in mental health, the question ultimately is going to be it depends. There are some overarching symptoms that will be commonly seen, such as many of the physiological responses that I mentioned, that fight, it used to just be fight or flight. Now it's fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I think there's another F word, if you will, thrown in there. And but that could be the body becoming very jittery and anxious to try to get the person out of the situation. They might become more numb because of what they experience, and that's the body's way of trying to kind of like tuck in like a turtle going in their shell to try to prevent them from any harm. They might be hypersensitive to any criticism or external like sensory things like lights and sounds and stuff like that. So there's common trends, but so technically, yes. The answer would be yes, there are common trends, but that doesn't mean that you can always predict how things are going to turn out. Um, would manifestations or entities presented in sleep or sleep paralysis be considered high strangeness? That's a great one. That's a great one. I think that's another it depends one. Um, I think it depends on an individual's definition of what high strangeness is. Um, Gosh, that's a really good one. Because some will see it as purely psychological. Um, some will see it as purely psychological and therefore doesn't fall under high strangeness. Uh, but there are many who don't. I hate to be terribly unhelpful. I think it depends on the individual and their definition of it. But potentially, yes. Um, And if a patient expressed interest in alternative treatments such as exorcism or other similar spiritual or religious treatments, would you encourage that patient to seek that? Yeah, definitely. So a more recent trend that I'm happy to see within mental health therapy, psychotherapy, is incorporating the client's spiritual practices, assuming that they have any, but incorporating the client's spirituality into their growth, assuming that that's something that is serious for them. That's something that they really care about. And especially if it just so happens that the clinician and the client have the same spiritual beliefs, they have the same spiritual traditions, then that can be really helpful. And there's been a lot of studies that have been coming out recently about the benefits and the mental health benefits um, of incorporating the client's spiritual practices into treatment. Whereas for the longest time, it was just ignored. Or if a client wanted to bring it up, then the therapist might try to pathologize it, or they would just go right past it. But that hasn't been the case recently. In terms of exorcisms, um, I know those can be intense, and then that goes into demonology and the extent to which, is it a demon or is it a form of psychosis? Even many professional exorcists, like professional people who have studied that and who've been doing it for decades and decades, even they will say that a quote unquote true demon possession will only be maybe like 1 out of 1,000 of the people that they're trying to help. It's 999 of those times it's a form of psychosis, it's a mental health concern. So but then it kind of comes into if that's what's helpful for the individual, then that's what's helpful for the individual. um, Great questions, great questions. We might have time for one more. I want to be mindful of our time at 7:50. No, it's 8 o'clock right now. um, Marcus, what do you think? Should we wrap it up, or do we have time for maybe one more?
Yeah, definitely time for one more, Joe, if anyone has any.
Yeah, and if nobody has any, then nobody has any. So maybe wait another 20, 30 seconds or so. And if nobody has any, then I'll close this out for tonight. But these are great questions. Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for literature? Yes, I do. So there's this book. Admittedly, I haven't finished the book yet, so I can't. Well, I can't speak to it entirely. But it addresses the post-traumatic growth faced by um, witnesses of the original Mothman sightings back in the late '60s in West Virginia. Not only the Mothman sightings, but also the collapse of the Silver Bridge in that area. Um, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it now. It's killing me that I can't remember it. A quick search might be able to pull that up. It was written by Bill and Jackie Kusulus, I believe. But there is that book out there that addresses the post-traumatic growth of the eyewitnesses of the Mothman sightings and the collapse of the Silver Bridge after those events had happened in the '60s, and what people did both individually and from a community standpoint to recover from that. In addition, there have been other research articles done that aren't necessarily as related to this topic, but there were research articles regarding, the actually small number of people who have been witnessing high strangeness phenomena who are exhibiting other maybe symptoms of psychosis, such as hallucinations or delusions, and how those are actually a really relatively small, fairly small portion of that population. That the majority of people who are claiming they've seen such things, specifically related to UFOs, actually do not fall within that category and don't have any of those kinds of symptoms. No, it's killing me that I can't remember the name of that book, but since I know the individual personally who asked that question, I'll follow up with them individually. But great questions. Great questions. And thank y'all, everybody, for participating tonight. I wanted to remind everyone to go ahead and do the feedback form at the end, so that way, I can do a better and better job at providing these kinds of presentations to the community. Thank y'all so much for showing up tonight. It was really, really great. And yeah, thank y'all again so much.